The second is an environmental variable, opportunity, or the amount of time that's available for learning. We measure it by allocated time, so that engaged time becomes allocated time times the engaged rate. We can understand the numerator in the function, the time needed to learn, breaking it down into 3 of the original 5 identified variables. 2 of them are individual level variables. The first is a student's aptitude, or his ability to learn academic material. And Carroll suggested that perhaps one of the best measures for that would be IQ. The second individual level variable is a student's ability to understand instruction, or prerequisite knowledge. And Carroll suggested that one of the ways that we could measure that was prior achievement. The third variable that's involved in the time needed to learn is an environmental variable, the quality of instruction. And it has to do with instructional methods or instructional techniques. So that, in the words of Bijou and Baer, Carroll's model becomes an interaction between the environment and the individual. Time spent is conceptualized as the interaction between perseverance and opportunity to learn. Time needed is the interaction between aptitude and ability to understand instruction and the quality of instruction. In 1974, Benjamin Bloom wrote about time and learning and conceptualized time in a couple of different ways. First, he talked about calendar time. Then he talked about elapsed time and how elapsed time interacted with time on task, and how time on task interacted with the concept of mastery learning as a teaching technique. He first reported on studies that were conducted during the 1950s. He had been involved in some of those studies and found, when they compared the achievement of students in the different states of the United States at the end of 12 school years, simply put, the average student in the lowest state had completed only an 8th grade education in 12 years. He found that a criterion level of achievement that had been attained by the highest 20% of the students on a given standardized test was attained by about 50% of the students a year later, and by about 80% of the students 2 years later. Again, that is to say, 4/5 of the students eventually reached a criterion of achievement that 1/5 of the students had attained 2 years earlier. Let's think just briefly about time on task. He reported being in classrooms that I'm sure we're all familiar with. Sometimes students enter the class by getting down to work immediately. They work almost entirely for the period of the hour of the class. Other students spend the first 15 to 20 minutes fumbling around. Following the preliminaries, they work on the task at hand for about 20 minutes, and then they spend about 20 minutes getting ready to leave the class. In other words, some students seem to be actively engaged in the learning during most of the class hour, while other students seem to be actively engaged in learning for only about 1/3 of the class hour. Well, what does mastery learning have to do with this? He observed a classroom in which some students were instructed using mastery learning techniques, and other students were instructed using what he called conventional learning techniques. The mastery students were given extra help, extra time, until they reached criterion at the end of each unit of study. The students in the conventional group were given no help until they took the final examination. On the first unit, all of the students seemed to be engaged about 65% of the time. Those students in the mastery condition progressed over successive units until by the time of the last unit they were actively engaged about 85% of the time. Those who were in the non-mastery condition, the conventional condition, eventually progressed until they were only engaged about 50% of the time. In other words, when the quality of instruction is high, the level of achievement of students and the time on task increases. When the quality of instruction is low, the level of achievement of students and their time on task in the classroom decreases. In 1978, Fisher coined the term academic learning time. In essence, academic learning time replaces the time spent learning variable in Carroll's model. And according to Fisher, it's defined as the amount of time spent working successfully on task-related content. In 2003, Hewitt broke this down a little bit more. He talked about 3 variables that are involved. The first is content overlap, or the percentage of tested content that's covered by students in the classroom. Involvement, the amount of time that students are actively engaged. And success, the extent to which students accurately complete assignments. In 1982, Caldwell, Hewitt, and Graeber completed a rather sobering analysis of academic learning time. They discussed it in terms of a number of variables. First, the length of the school year, generally set for most purposes at 180 days. The attendance year. Most students don't come to school all the time. Sometimes they're sick, sometimes they're on vacation, sometimes they just decide to cut school. So the attendance year tends to be less than the school year. In fact, they found that the attendance year varied from about 150 days to 170 days. The length of the school day, generally set by some policy that's in place, can range anywhere from about 4.5 hours to 5.5 hours. The allocated time in the school day for learning basic skills ranged from a high of about 150 minutes to a low of about 90 minutes in terms of learning to read. In terms of learning math, ranged from about a high of about 60 minutes to a low of about 30 minutes. They talked about engaged rate. They talked about engaged time, which is a number of minutes that's obtained when we take allocated time and multiply it by engaged rate. And they talked about content overlap and success rate. In general, their findings are presented in this table. They collected data on time variables from a number of studies. No single study had collected data on all of the time variables that are mentioned. So they used the arithmetic average for all of those studies that they could find that collected data on the various measures. They assigned that average to the average column, calculating the standard deviation of all of the information that they had gathered. They subtracted one standard deviation from the average column to obtain the numbers in the low column, and they added one standard deviation to obtain the numbers in the high column. What I want you to see is in the final portion of that table, look at the basic skills total. Those minutes that are spent learning basic skills on a daily basis in the low, average, and high condition. Let's put that into Carroll's model of school learning. School learning is a function of, at least in part, the amount of time given to learning and the amount of time needed for a student to learn. So somewhere between 4 and 32 minutes are given to math learning, depending upon what condition that we're in. It seems quite obvious then, at least to me, that we cannot squander precious minutes of educational time. We must attend to the most efficient method of instruction for each and every student with whom we come in contact. In 1968, Skinner began to work on what has been termed programmed instruction. His daughter had just begun attending 4th grade. He went to her 4th grade math class for Father's Day. Having observed the 4th grade math class, as he put it, through no fault of her own, the teacher was violating almost everything we knew about the learning process. In the math class, children didn't find out if one problem was correct before they went on to the next. They had to answer a whole page before they got any feedback, and then they probably didn't get any feedback until the next day. The question is, how can one teacher with 20 or 30 children possibly shape mathematical behavior in each one? Clearly, teachers needed help. So Skinner developed what he termed a teaching machine. That teaching machine simply presented problems in random order for students to do with feedback after each one. But this machine that he had developed didn't teach a new behavior. All it did was really give more practice on the skills that the students had already learned. Within 3 years, Skinner developed programmed instruction where, through careful sequencing, students responded to material that had been broken down into small steps. The steps were similar to what a skilled tutor would ask of a student working with one student at a time. The first response of each sequence was prompted, but as performance improved, less and less help was given. Students were given immediate feedback, and students progressed only after they had demonstrated mastery of the material that was included in each of the learning units. Now, there were difficulties with implementing early efforts at programmed instruction. In general, textbooks into which this instructional technique had been embedded could not maintain the contingencies of reinforcement. Students could look at the answers that were provided as feedback before they had ever completed their own answers. Instructional designers began to realize that tutorials need to do more than just present blocks of content with quizzes at the end. Effective instruction requires learners to respond to what each unit of information presents to get feedback on their performance before they advance to the next. The sequencing of steps is critical.